JRPGs stay dominating my personal game of the year. Last year it was Xenoblade. This year it's Final Fantasy 16, baby.
You're listening to Personality, your gateway to the latest in gaming news.
Man, so I just completed Final Fantasy 16. I absolutely love that game. If you haven't played Final Fantasy 16, don't get yourself spoiled if you've got a PC and you're waiting on that version, first and foremost. So wait for that, play the game, or if you have a PS5 and you're just sitting on the fact that I don't think this game is gonna be me, and then dude, just get out of your comfort zone sometimes. I mean, how are you a true, and I've got to put true here, how are you a true Final Fantasy fan, but you feel weirded out every time the series does everything? I think Final Fantasy's whole branding is the fact that every game is so different from each other, yet still maintains the core elements that make it a Final Fantasy game. I'm sure, most people wanted that party element, those other systems. It's not in the game, deal with it. It's still a good game. And that is what I love about Final Fantasy, and that's why they remain kings of the JRPG franchise, hands down. And with it, we've actually got a report from Square. So once again, Square's expectations haven't been met. Currently, they gave us some figures. They're actually showing us some key reports from their 6-month financial results. And we're seeing that most of their targets were not met. A majority of this comes from the fact that it's not that Final Fantasy 16 isn't selling well. That's stupid. It's doing pretty good, especially for an exclusive. It's the fact that they would have had to, use resources, taking time, money, development costs, all of that poured into creating Final Fantasy 16, along with other projects that they have done. Unfortunately, as well, they didn't get the target sales for their mobile games, despite the fact that Ever Crisis also launched this year recently. It's got a bunch of microtransactions that you could partake into. Thumbs up making, Square that bread, but people don't really want to beat up that much for that game. And of course, the series on a whole has increased by 5 million, bringing it to a total sale of 185 million units sold as of September 30th, which means that Final Fantasy 16 and the Pixel remasters this year put in the work. And I must say, there was some net sales in the MMO game sub-segment, and the net sales fell compared to the same period of the previous year. Now, the thing is, that made me think about what is the next step for Final Fantasy? What is the future of Final Fantasy looking like? Now, when you see these reports of, money's down or something, they didn't expect that, it looks bad, honestly. And maybe you have certain expectations, you don't meet it. But we know that the future is looking good. First things first, Final Fantasy 16 still has to get that PC port, and based on the reception of fans, they're working on DLC for this game already. So Creative Business Unit 3 is heavy on work, giving us more Final Fantasy 16 content. I don't know where they're gonna take it from, whether it's the game's conclusion, if they're gonna give us some time, because there's a lot of time skips within Final Fantasy 16, if they're gonna give us some time to shine on other characters, what they were doing in time skips and certain sessions of the game that we didn't get a chance to see portrayed to us in the main story or main campaign of Final Fantasy 16. Also on the immediate come up is the soon approaching 7.0 update to Final Fantasy 14. Let me tell you something. If you haven't played Final Fantasy 14, what are you waiting for? That's as JRPG experience as it gets with people that you play with. I mean, Final Fantasy 14 is a fantastic game, and with their upcoming Dawn Trail update and expansion coming sometime next year, Final Fantasy is about to be, once again, that critically received MMO. Hopefully they cook. That's Creative Business Unit 3. We believe. I believe they'll cook. And added to that, maybe, that will boost up the sale. Maybe some people are not interested in the Endwalker content that kind of had to fill up before we got to Dawn Trail, and the subscriptions may have dropped. But Dawn Trail is definitely adding a new feel to the game, not only because it's an expansion, but also because of the upcoming graphical quality update that they already announced is coming to Final Fantasy. They were able to show off some at the Fan Fest, and I must say, it's looking amazing, and I can't wait to get back on Final Fantasy 14. And let me tell you, if you haven't played Final Fantasy 14, you don't have to buy it immediately. Just play the free trial. They've added another expansion that wasn't unlocked in the free trial. It's unlocked now. Great story. Is probably one of the best Final Fantasy games you could definitely play. No joke. Just come on. Play Final Fantasy 14. Get out of your shell that you only could play Final Fantasy if it's turn-based, because it hasn't been that way since like 2000, and play these games. And of course, after that, we've got the best month coming up next year. It's gonna officially be called, by me, February, because we're getting Persona Reload, then we're getting Grand Blue Fantasy Relink, and then on top of that, we got Final Fantasy VII Rebirth coming. As more information comes out on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, more than what's already available, some are kind of story spoilerish. I don't really want to get into that terrain, but as more reports come out, you bet your bottom dollar we're going to be covering it here on this channel, and we're going to be discussing the news of what's happening. But there were some valid criticisms of Final Fantasy XVI that I think Square should take into account, and that was mainly to deal with the fact that some people feel like Final Fantasy has drifted a bit too much from the core elements. I think that's a valid criticism within itself, even though Final Fantasy as a franchise strive to be different every entry, so I don't really understand how come like we're still confused at what Final Fantasy is supposed to be at this point. But okay, it's not really properly defined, but it is whatever Final Fantasy is at the time, whatever it wants to be. But we're getting reports that there is a potential Final Fantasy IX remake on the horizon, something that has not been announced yet, that we're potentially going to see, and I don't think there's a better remake in terms of the past Final Fantasy catalog that could really bring us back to the Final Fantasy, quote-unquote Final Fantasy feel, other than a Final Fantasy IX remake. Some people want it to be 10. I mean 10 has an HD version. 10 is objectively in a very good place to be consumed. I don't think it needs an update anytime soon. Personally speaking, for me, it's probably 8 that needs it, but I don't think Squall and Cloud's personality clashing at the same time, being on the leaderboard for Final Fantasy charting the way forward, I don't think they should happen at the same time, even though technically they did happen one after the other. But Final Fantasy IX is a good way for the series to return to its roots, because literally, that was the initial mission of Final Fantasy IX in the first place. They felt like it was a departure from the game's core in titles like 6, 7, and 8, but 9 brought that back. And it kind of aligns with what I think the Final Fantasy series should return to. In fact, I think tactics should be paid attention. I think what Square should do is really pay attention to how Persona 5 Tactica is going to be received. I mean, look at how Fire Emblem is being received now. And, you know, let's see Final Fantasy Tactics make a resurgence in terms of relevance. But guys, that is all we've got to talk about today. So Square Enix, once again, producing their financial results that we're actually looking at here. Do you think Square Enix sometimes makes too much bold assumptions of their product, or is it that they have confidence in the brand? I mean, oftentimes you see that they're not hitting their targets, but they're relatively right there. So they forecasted 360, this is in millions, in yen of course, 360 million net sales, but the actual for this period is at 343,267 million. So sometimes I think they shoot too much, but of course if you have confidence in your product, if you have confidence in your brand, then definitely forecast something is better. Sometimes you forecast a target to hit it rather than shoot it low, and then you only perform at that level to get that. But definitely a lot of the cost that we're seeing is attributed from the fact that they were developing these games. I even think that next year when we see Rebirth, we actually will see a positive increase in the sales, definitely because of the popularity behind Final Fantasy VII, but there are other operational costs that would come with that game that would be reflected on the financial reports. But based on what we're seeing in terms of sales, there's a future for Final Fantasy, definitely, and it's going nowhere according to the people who thought it was and wanted, in my opinion, wanted Final Fantasy XVI to fail. You did not get what you wanted. Based on what Square Enix is telling us in terms of what is the general sales numbers, and in terms of the results, we're possibly going to see a lot more once this is fully ported over to PC and more people can experience and purchase the game. And of course, when the DLC comes out, you know that brings in its own crowd. But I'll see you guys in the next video. But until then, stay gaming.